In Coffee with Dan, I have a very special guest. The topic is foreign policy. We know that the topic is a very important subject for a country in this new international economic order. Foreign policy plays an important role in any country's domestic and international affairs. I have here in studios with me in Coffee with Dan this morning, Mr. Sugeeshwara Senadeera. He is the Director of Research and International Media of the Presidential Secretariat in Colombo. A vast experience in foreign affairs and foreign policies, having worked in several embassies in Sri Lanka, including Norway, Oslo, and New Delhi. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce from University of Delhi as well as a postgraduate from University of Cambridge. So welcome to studios, Mr. Senadeera.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So talking about our topic, the foreign policy, let me first ask you, foreign policy during the first decade of the post-independence era was a very crucial turning point for Sri Lanka. So how could you explain this?
Well, it is the vast transformation since that time up to the Asia-centric middle path foreign policy of President Maithripala Sirisena. Well, post-independence first decade, that is from 48 to 56, we adhered to the foreign policy of United Kingdom or the British colonial rulers, though we obtained political independence in 48. We did not change our constitution to be a republic, and we considered the king or queen as the head of our state. Hence, we had, when it comes to defense and external affairs, we followed the British policy, and we even allowed the Karunayak British base to continue. The transformation took place later. You see, during that period, the first decade, we could not even get the membership of United Nations because Russia vetoed against our entry. It was a subservient foreign policy, I should say, at that juncture. But with the change, the impending change in 1955 and elections in 1956, we not only obtained the United Nations membership, we ushered into a new era of neutrality. I wouldn't call non-alignment then. You see, after attending the Bandung conference, John Kothawala also realized the importance of Pancasila principle and weaning away from the British colonial mentality. However, he did not take any effective steps, though way back in 1952 also we had some sort of trade agreements with countries like China. We had China Rice Rubber Pact, though we didn't have diplomatic relations then with China. So with the post-independence, real change took place in 56.
Now, you mentioned about the Pancasila, and we know that in 1956, the Sri Lankan politics went through a shift transformation. So how did this Pancasila and the post-1956 transformation took place?
It started with Bandung conference, where Sri Nehru, Sir John Kothawala, Suharto, Sukarno, then Ghanaian President Nkrumah, they all took part. Even Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia. So there was no concept of non-alignment then. However, China's agreement on Pancasila, that is, the Pancasila is non-interference in each other's affairs and so on. Peace, non-interference, then sovereignty, respect for sovereignty, these things we adhered to since 1954 Bandung. With the transformation of 56, the political change in government in Colombo, we took steps to establish diplomatic relations with China as well as Russia, and we did not join any of the pacts, though. was either Warsaw Pact or NATO. But we maintained neutrality during the Bandaranaike period, and subsequently Mrs. Sirimava Bandaranaike, she came to power in 1960, and in 61 she attended the first non-aligned conference, and she played a major role in guiding the non-aligned nations. She became a pioneer in the non-aligned movement together with Nehru, Tito, Nasser, Nkrumah and Sukarno. With this, the world saw the new change in the international relations. McCarthy eras of the US and die-hard eras of Stalin and follow-up of Khrushchev, that gradually declined, and they also realized the need for peace first, and then subsequently they also agreed not to be the first use of atomic weapons, then the later nuclear weapons. With that, the concept of non-alignment took deep roots, though today non-alignment is rather irrelevant because of the recent political developments, collapse of Soviet Union and so on.
So now we know that Sri Lanka inherited the Commonwealth system and the Westminster parliamentary strategies that came from the pre-independence era. But then in 1972, we became a republic under the former Prime Minister Sirimava Bandaranaike. And then she brought in this non-alignment participation for Sri Lanka in 1960s onwards. Of course, she advocated this non-alignment approach for Sri Lanka. So how did this took place between the Prime Minister Sirimava Bandaranaike's government and the non-alignment movement from 1916 onwards?
Well, before, as you rightly mentioned, we became a republic in 1972. It was a bit too late. Actually, India became independent on 15th August 1947. And within 3 years, they adopted the new constitution and became a republic on 1950 January 26. But we continue to be, what do you call it, was under the dominion system, the government under the British head of the state. We continued that until 1972, though Bandaranaike's 1956 manifesto also emphasized on the need to become a republic. He did not have time to implement it because his government was preoccupied with various issues like, newly found freedom, the leftist movement organized continuous strikes and so on. So during his period of 3.5 years, he could not implement the promise. Mrs. Bandaranaike's first government of 1960 also faced a lot of problems because it had a very narrow majority. However, in 1970, one of the first steps she took was to turn the parliament into a constituent assembly and adopted the new constitution, which was drafted by Colin R. De Silva, Felix Das Bandaranaike and others. And with that, we became a republic, and we had the first Governor William Gopal, who was the Governor General during the British time. He became the President of Sri Lanka. With that, our complete political independence and sovereignty was assured with that step. Mrs. Bandaranaike continued her policy of non-alignment during the remaining period of hers until 1977. But then, as you know, subsequently there was a change.
Now, down the lane, then the welfare state status of Sri Lanka was became a challenge in the open economy introduced during the 1977 Jaya Jayawardena government. And then we turned into a more pro-Western tilt in our foreign relations. So what impact that the open economy and this pro-Western tilt of the 77 government really did domestically as well as internationally?
Open economy was a tremendous boost to the industrial and economic revolution in the country, because the Sri Lanka became the first country in South Asia to adopt the open economy. And J.R. Jayawardena thought with the introduction of open economy, we could also become we could follow suit what the East Asian tigers had shown us. You see, Korea, Singapore, Thailand, and other countries, Indonesia, and so on in Southeast Asia. And in fact, he was toying with the idea of joining ASEAN despite the geographical distance. But on the issue of pro-Western tilt, we have antagonized India. We have to understand the geopolitical situation, and the reality is that whether we like or not, we have to live with India. So we have to have a perfect understanding whatever we do with India. That doesn't mean we should be subservient to India, but we have to have a perfect balance, and which the J.R. Jayawardena failed to do. And antagonizing India, at that time, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister of India. She was more an autocrat than a democrat. So that resulted in direct and indirect interference in Sri Lankan affairs. Issues like the Tamil issue, the ethnic issue, and 1983 riots gave ample opportunities for India for direct intervention. J.R. Jayawardena first expected help from the Western world to ward off the pressures from India, but that did not come through. Finally, he succumbed to pressure and signed the Indo-Sri Lanka Agreement of July 29, 1987. That was a one-sided agreement, and that has vastly affected our sovereignty, because there were 4 clauses. Rather, in the agreement itself, it was a perfect bilateral agreement. But in the agreement, there's a reference to 2 letters exchanged by President Jayawardena and Rajiv Gandhi, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. In the agreement, though there's no reference to any internal issues directly, but in the letters, there's a clause about Trincomalee oil tanks that will not be given to any outside power without consulting India, and so on and so forth. The amalgamation of Northeast as temporarily as one province, and granting citizenship to all stateless persons. Stateless persons, also we had 2 agreements during Mrs. Bandaranaike's time. First with Mrs. Bandaranaike and Lal Bahadur Shastri of India in 1964. That agreement, allowed us to give citizenship to 325,000 and 525,000 to be deported to India. Subsequently, the balance of 150,000 was divided again in the second agreement of 1974 between Indira Gandhi and Sri Bandaranaike. That they decided to split that 75,000 each from out of that 150,000. The backlog was actually India. We should have sent to India according to that agreement. But however, after 87 agreement, J.R. Jayawardena in one stroke of pen, he granted citizenship to 94,000 remaining stateless persons. That was India's quota. So these kind of clauses were detrimental to our sovereignty.
Now, as you correctly said, the 1987 Sri Lanka-India Accord made some very swift changes in our local administration as well. Especially the 13th Amendment came subsequent to that. And then you were talking about the Antagonizing India that has created some issues. And then the Accord helped it to patch up the relations of the foreign relations between Sri Lanka and India. So Antagonizing India and then coming into this 1987 Accord, what are the adverse repercussions that the country faced?
As I mentioned, you see, we did not have free hand on deciding certain issues like amalgamation of Northeast, then oil tank farm, the Voice of America transmission stations. So there were certain clauses which infringe upon our sovereignty. But there were pluses also. Initially, our war, rather than the war between the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam and the Sri Lankan forces, became India deployed the IPKF, Indian Peacekeeping Army, Indian Peacekeeping Force, IPKF, and they, within 3 months, by October 1987, they ended up fighting the LTTE. So, while our forces were confined to barracks, Indian Army had to fight the LTT for 2.5 years, losing over 1,500 of their own men and weakening the LTT to a vast strength. So that was a plus point. And then India also understood that this was not a case of militancy, this is a pure terrorism. The way the IPK force attacked ruthlessly by the LTT initially, and equally ruthlessly they retaliated and killed vast number of LTTs, as well as in the bargain there are many civilians died. So with this understanding with India, gradually the world also saw the menace of terrorism in Sri Lanka, and that helped us to initially to give the message to the world this is a question of terrorism and not a question of armed militancy fighting for their aspirations.
This morning in Coffee with Dan, we are discussing about the foreign policy of Sri Lanka. The Sugeeshwara Senadeera is the Director of Research and International Media of the Presidential Secretariat in Colombo. Mr. Sugeeshwara has a vast experience in the foreign service, having served in our embassies in Paris, Norway and New Delhi, and having his educational background also in the related areas from University of Delhi and from University of Cambridge. Now, turning back to our discussion, Sugeeshwara, we know that in order to win the LTTE war, the Mahinda Rajapaksa government went into a different scope with regard to foreign policy, and he perceived as hostile by the West. We are now trying to again patch up. So what do you think about these changes and how we should proceed in the future?
The change at that time, the Western world, especially due to the Norway's involvement as a peacemaker, the West, especially US, as well as the European Union countries, they look at through the same angle as Norway, because Norway had sessions in Washington and London. Erik Solheim's mission to Colombo was not direct flights to Colombo. You see, whenever he used to come, almost every month or so he used to come, or at least every quarter. During that time, he used to have consultations in Washington and New York with various countries in the United Nations, as well as in Washington, then London, and also Paris. Finally, the India also got little upset about the direct discussions with Prabhakaran, so they gave the message through a newspaper advertisement. Interestingly, a newspaper advertisement was published in Indian papers that Velupilli Prabhakaran is wanted for the killing of Rajiv Gandhi. This was an interesting advertisement that came prior to Solheim's third visit to Colombo. Immediately, Solheim changed his flight plans, he came through New Delhi and briefed in New Delhi. On the way out also, he flew to Oslo through New Delhi, briefing New Delhi. So finally, New Delhi was also satisfied about the peace. At least they decided not to interfere in the peace process because of Norway's influence. So somehow, when the war started, or the last phase of the conflict started, because of Norway's influence, Western world came heavily on President Mahinda Rajapaksa to have a ceasefire. But he refused to do so, and that antagonized the entire West, especially Miliband and Kushner's visit. The French and UK foreign ministers visited to stop the final phase of the war. President Rajapaksa, throwing away the diplomatic protocols, he went to Ambilipitia and said that if they wanted to meet me, they should come to Ambilipitia. So under a tree in Ambilipitia, he discussed the issue and refused to budge. And Western world was furious. But at that time, it was a good thing in the interest of the nation. But subsequently, after 2009, the military victory, instead of going for reconciliation and because basically it's an internal issue of Sri Lanka, so instead of going in for reconciliation and devolution or whatever the Tamil people wanted in this country, instead he went on his own agenda, succumbing to the Sinhala Buddhist pressures. So with that, there was no meeting of aspirations of the Tamil people, and the President Maithripala Sirisena, when he came to power in 2015 January, the entire Tamil people, thought he would be the best person to address this issue, and rightly they voted for him and elected him. And the Maithripala Sirisena's foreign policy as well as local policy with regard to the devolution of power was accepted by the world, and we have a very good rapport now with the Western world, entire world. You see, now President Sirisena visited many countries during the past 2.5 years, and the welcome he received was tremendous. It was a very warm welcome, and the leaders went out of the way to greet him and treat him, welcome him. I'll give two examples. Now, the last visit, when he went to Korea, President Park, without waiting for the official talks to begin, he came to the temple where on the first day of immediately after arrival in Seoul, President wanted to go to a Korean temple. Korean temple which had links with Sri Lanka, because Anagarika Dharmapala had donated sacred relics to that temple. So President decided to go to the temple before the official visit. And when he arrived there, he found a very pleasant surprise was there for him. President Park was waiting with the chief high priest of the temple to receive him. So that's a great gesture, and what President Park said was that I decided to come because I wanted to have a personal rapport with you before the official talks, because I have much admiration for you. Similarly, when the President went to see Putin, and the first thing Putin did was he took out a sword, a well-carved, beautiful silver sword, and presented it to him. He had bought it from Sotheby's in London auction. You know, he's one of the Russian multimillionaires, and he had gifted this to Putin. And President Putin decided to give it to the President Sirisena because it was a Sri Lankan Candian antique. So these are the gestures you can see. These leaders went beyond the official receptions and welcome to greet the President Sirisena. So that shows the strength of our relations with the world.
What we know is that Sri Lanka is strategically located in the Indian Ocean, and for both India and China, Sri Lanka is important geopolitically. It's in order to show the mutual power of each other. And what I believe is not to acquire Sri Lanka or not to conquer Sri Lanka, but to show the power to each other. Sri Lanka has been used as a geopolitically important and strategic place. When it comes to India, you talked about the oil tanks, that the letters that have been exchanged between President Jayawardena and the Gandhis at that time. But we know that the letters do not make much impact when there is an accord in place. And on the other hand, the Chinese maritime Silk Route policy now turning towards the Hambantota port with their proposed Kra Canal project, Hambantota becoming a very strategic location. So what would be the future in attracting Sri Lanka to these two countries, especially our big neighbors beside each other?
Well, you see, rivalry between the powers is there are always, you see, in these rivalries have resulted in many wars. The World War I as well as World War II are results of that. Then we have seen the Korean War, Vietnam War, all these things happen because of the power rivalry between the great powers, so-called great powers. Now, when it comes to Asian powers, we have very good relations with India. We have to have excellent relations with India for anything. And whatever we do with the perfect understanding with India. Because I know very well President Sirisena as well as Prime Minister Vikramasinghe made repeated visits to Delhi and discussed these issues before granting the permission to restarting of Colombo Harbour project, the Port City project, as well as Hambantota Port project. And India also is satisfied with whatever the vast projects we have given. Is in now Norachole is to be converted into a gas plant with Indian assistance if possible. Then Matale Airport, Kankasanture Airport expansion project, then when it comes to Trinco and the oil tank farms. So we have, and also Sampur proposed power plant. All these things are, I find that the well balanced, and also these are economic issues. These are not political, and we have a very good understanding with China that Hambantota will be purely a commercial venture, and it will not be used for any military ambitions. So with this understanding, I'm sure that we can get the maximum out of these two powers. And it's I know it's tight rope walk, but at the same time it's beneficial to us economically. So why not? And we don't have any alternative. We just can't keep the Hambantota port closed and Matale Airport closed for years and keep the oil tanks idle for years. And it had happened for now nearly 5 decades. So these things are economic resources. We should capitalize on them. As you rightly said, we are at a very important center in the Asian Silk Route and strategically located very close to the international maritime routes. With that, we should get the maximum benefits. I think that we are doing a perfect job with regard to that.
You mentioned that His Excellency Sirisena government is very welcome in the international relations at present. And also, the Honorable Ranil Wickramasinghe, when he came to power, he said that he would like to administer the country according to the Lichavi policies of India. And we do have the Tamil diaspora issue right now. And many countries are looking at Sri Lanka, how we tackle the Tamil diaspora issue domestically as well as within our foreign policy. So what would be the way forward in this respect?
The way forward is to continue the path we have chosen so far. Now, when it comes to balancing these powers, we have done a perfect job. Then one of the swords of Damocles, you can say that what is hanging over our head is United Nations the Human Rights Commission issue in Geneva. That Geneva issue, we have come to a certain agreement, and we have passed a joint resolution with 17 members of the council, 43-member council, and they have given us ample space, I must say. Now, 2 more years have been granted for implementation of our reconciliation process, certain agreed terms. But President has very clearly said, Prime Minister also said, that we will not accept foreign judges. We get foreign technical assistance and so on. That goes well within our foreign policy, because there's we are not allowing any direct foreign interference in our domestic affairs. This is purely a domestic affair. So, and we have a strong judiciary, and there's certain areas to be strengthened, and for that we need the international support. And the United Nations and the various Western countries have offered us sufficient assistance to provide us with technical support for the development of judiciary, parliamentary process, the committee system in Sri Lanka, the adoption of new constitution. We are not succumbing to any pressures from anybody. We simply get the assistance, advice. Advice is necessary. We have to live with the world. You see, this global village, we have to live with the world, and unless we are a signatory when it comes to trade, we are a signatory to WTO. So within WTO rules, we have to do these things. Similarly, President, Prime Minister and others have openly declared that we are fully committed to the United Nations Charter. So we go through this process with maintaining our sovereignty, balancing the powers, and getting the maximum support out of the Western world, the Eastern powers, the Asian powers, including Japan, not only China and India, then Korea. With all this support, I think the government is planning to develop our economy to ensure that our people have a better living conditions.
Let me ask you finally, now when it comes to economic affairs, we need to enter into many trade pacts as possible in order to promote our goods at the export market and also attract the import market to the country. So what are the futuristic scopes that the government is going to enter within this foreign policy of the government with regard to the trade pacts?
Trade pacts, as I said, we are a signatory to WTO. Then we have signed several bilateral agreements, FTAs, with several countries. We are going to have some more FTAs. The free trade agreements are very useful in present day, and we are attracting investors. So when we get investors and when our production goes up, we have to enter into the huge markets. These products are not at all, they are vast productions, and they have to go beyond our market. So our free trade agreement is with India, a billion people are living. See, that huge market is very attractive to foreign investors. And we have a free trade agreement, and there are plans to expand it, because we have learned certain lessons, you see, during implementation of free trade agreement, during which our trade with India has multiplied many times. But there are, in certain areas, our indigenous entrepreneurs are worried about certain aspects of the free trade agreement and the proposed ECTA, Economic and Trade Agreement. And India is ready to discuss these issues. So once we enter into a larger SEPA or whatever, ECTA or whatever the name. You see, once a large agreement is there, I'm sure it will be very beneficial to Sri Lanka because we will attract more investors. They are not looking at the Sri Lankan market, the foreign investors, because the huge Indian market is an attraction to them. So we can use that to the maximum. At the same time, we have very good economic relations with the rest of the world, the China, the South Korea, Japan, and then we got our fish export ban lifted. Then GSP plus, our apparel garment industry will find it's very attractive to send our goods to the European market. So these agreements are quite useful, and we should continue in these lines.
We see that the Sri Lankan policy is becoming very multifaceted right now. And this morning, it was a very interesting discussion I had with Mr. Sugeeshwara Senadeera, who is the Director of Research and International Media of the Presidential Secretariat, in today's Coffee with Dan. Thank you very much, Mr. Sugeeshwara Senadeera, for being here in Coffee with Dan this morning.
Thanks, Dan. It's really a pleasure to have a chat with you.
So I will join our dear listeners tomorrow with another interesting topic. Dr. Pakyasoti Saravanamuthu is going to join me tomorrow with, in Coffee with Dan to discuss about the proposed constitutional reforms in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much.